Patrick Muller was born in 1954 and is one of 7 children to parents Albert and Vonnie Muller. His mother Vonnie is 100 years old. Patrick's great-great-grandfather Jacob and wife Annie, with 3 young children, migrated to Australia on December 1854 from Hamburg, Germany. Germans were assisted to emigrate if the British could not supply the skills, mainly in agriculture and wine. They travelled with 500 others on the ship Cateaux Wattel, that is Caeuxwattel. Jacob and his family then boarded the vessel Norma, arriving in the Shoalhaven on the 14th of March 1955. He was indentured to work for David Berry. They lived initially in a house at Back Forest. Jacob was naturalised in 1861, which enabled him to buy land. He remained all his life working on the estate at Coolangatta as a plasterer. He bought a house in 1880 in Berry Street, Nowra, deeding this to his son George in 1882. George was to follow in his footsteps and became a builder after his father's passing. Next son John bought an initial 86 acres from John Hay, which was part of the Meroo estate, in 1893, when the larger Berry estate lands were being sold. His brother George built his house, Pomona. 5 generations of the Muller family were to grow up and farm at Pomona. Pomona today is heritage listed and was the heart of the Meroo community throughout the 20th century. John married Mary Host in 1877 and had 7 children. His son Albert married Bridget Morrissey in 1912 and leased Pomona till 1941. Then he purchased it. They had 8 children. Their son Albert stayed at Pomona and worked as a share farmer after he marries Vonnie Walsh in 1948. They purchased Pomona in 1959. For Pomona to survive the introduction of milk quotas in the 60s and 70s, extra land had to be purchased, even though farm practices and machinery were improving. It was a rapidly changing industry and economic environment. Patrick Muller, their son, was to remain with the farm and bought Pomona in 1986 with wife Jeanette King from Numba. They left the property forever in 2016, having sold the bulk of the property a few years earlier. Continuous ownership by the Muller family for approximately 120 years, Patrick recalls his daily life farming in Meroo and reflects on the challenges and the stories that have been passed to him by his neighbours and his ancestors. I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed it. So thanks for joining us today, Patrick Muller.
That's okay.
How are you going?
Very good, thanks. Yeah, very good. It's interesting to see what you're doing with this history. It's important, I think, that it's recorded.
We're still in Meroo Meadow, and today we're going to talk about Lamonds Lane, where you grew up. So how far back does your family go in Lamonds Lane?
My great-grandfather purchased a block, 86 acres in Lamonds Lane in 1893 when the Berry estate was being sold up. Before that, he had arrived in Australia with his father and his elder brother George in 1856. They came from a place called Fronstein in Germany. My great-great-grandfather Jacob came out as an indentured labour for the Berry estate, and he came out as a vine dresser, but I think he ended up doing a lot of work as a plasterer. And John was 3 when he came out, my great-grandfather. He was working on the farm, and then eventually he ended up getting a lease share farming agreement with David Berry, and working out at Farm Meadow.
Do you recall what ship they came out on and what his wife's name was and how many kids?
The ship was the Cateaux Wattel, and I believe it sailed from Hamburg. Came out with his wife. I think his wife's name was Anna. Yeah, they arrived in Sydney and moved down to the coast, working with the Berry Estate, and he eventually signed a share farming agreement with in 1877 to share farm on that estate.
So that agreement, is that the agreement that I have here in my file?
Yes, yeah, that's...
Who gave you that?
It's just been passed on down through the family. My great-grandfather, actually, John, was a very avid diary keeper, and he kept diaries for 1870s right up to nearly to when he passed away in 1941 at the age of 91 or 2. So we've been able to glean a lot of information out of those diaries, and it's a fascinating insight into life on the farm and around that time.
That land agreement, is that the land that Lamonds Lane is on today?
No, the share farming agreement was out at Back Forest, somewhere out there. But then when the estate it was being sold in 1893, he would have been about 40 then, so he purchased the 86 acres at Meroo. We know from the fact, because there was a diary entry where he paid £36 an acre for the 86 acres, which we think was a fair amount of money then, but you've got to remember that Tandingullah Creek flowed through the property and provided a water source at the time. But there would have been a lot of clearing to do, there would have been a lot of trees, which would have been done by hand. He started a dairy farm up there pretty well straight away, milking cows, and they also established an orchard, and that's the name Pomona is Roman for the goddess of fruit. So they established a fairly extensive orchard there, and some of those original trees that were planted are still there, although they're sort of getting a bit tired now.
Can you describe the orchard?
Yeah, it had a variety of different trees: plum trees, peach trees, pear trees, apples. And I know there was persimmon trees, locust trees. There was a lot of different types of fruit grown there.
And where did the fruit go?
A lot of it would have been used by the family, and we know this from the diaries that they used to grow a lot of vegetables, and a lot of those vegetables were grown and then on-sold through to Sydney on the train in the early part of the 20th century.
Okay, what else do you know about your great-grandfather?
He was very active. They were very active in the community. He was very community-minded. He actually had a tennis court built at the front of the property, which was used by the local community. He also had a cricket pitch built behind the old dairy that's still there in the Lamonds Lane, and the cricket pitch is still actually there, although it's a bit worn now, underneath all the grass. And we used to, when we were kids, we used to play there. There was a Meroo Cricket Club, the MCC or the MMCC, and they used to play in local competitions and travel quite extensively around the place, and villages like Camberwarra, Piree, Bowlong.
What sort of cows do you know? Was he breeding or was...
They would have had Ayrshire cows originally to start with, and they were mostly Ayrshires or crossbred cows. Grandfather, there was a new dairy built there in 1917 on the property, just not far from Pomona. That building is still standing, although it's been modified a bit. He built that in 1917, and he was one of the first in the district to install milking machines for the cows to be milked. So prior to that, they would have been milking by hand.
Do you know what, was it a walk-through?
Yeah, walk-through would have been, originally it was 8 unit, but 4 double-up units and 4 milking machines. It was like that for a long while then. I think my father doubled them up so they could milk 8, and eventually we converted that dairy into a herringbone dairy.
When did Pomona first get built, and do you know anything about the plans around and the purpose?
We don't have any plans for it, but as I said, my great-grandfather's brother George built that for him in what would have been, not long after the purchase of it. Would have been started to build straight away because they would have had to live somewhere. So
this is George Muller.
George Muller, yeah.
Did he build anything else nearby?
Yeah, I think he did build the place called Exeter, which is the one on the hill just opposite the Meroo Road down there, and also here I know of another place that's just at the bottom of Morton's Hill, where Bowlong Road joins the highway. There's a house in there, old house there. I believe he built that, and probably other houses around the Nowra area as well.
So they came out from Germany as...
It came out, I think, as a vine dresser, but my great-great-grandfather ended up working as a plasterer and sort of builder, and probably doing agricultural pursuits as well. So.
Do you know if they ever grew vines?
Don't think so, no. He used to go to the Sydney show, preparing the district exhibits. There's a lot of mention of that in the diaries about how he went to Sydney. And because of their involvement in the community and the way they embraced the community and invited people into their home and into the property, into Pomona, they went to my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother went to New Zealand, I think in about 1920, and when they arrived back, they were presented with an illuminated address, which I'm not sure whether you're familiar with, but it was a big framed address just thanking them for their contribution to the community and how well they were received by the community and how they were perceived by the community. It was something that took pride of place hanging on the wall at Pomona, because it just embraced what my great-grandfather and great-grandmother did for the community.
Let's talk a bit more about the house.
Later days, the Sunday school picnic used to be held there. When the Meroo school was going, they'd have a picnic day there once a year, which involved all the local kids and community and families coming together. And
do you remember those yourself?
Oh yeah, I can remember the picnic.
So tell me a bit more about your lived experience of it.
I have a guilty conscience about that, because I know they used to have they had a big tent and they'd had an ice cream, the canvas bags of ice cream with the dry ice in them, and all the ice creams in there. And I can recall myself and another kid, and I don't know who it was, thought that was just too tempting, so we snuck around the back and got in and took an ice cream each which meant we probably got 2 for the day.
That's pretty normal.
It was just one of those things. There was the races they used to have, the 3-legged races and egg and spoon races and all sorts of things there. It was just a great community day.
How many people would be there?
Oh, I don't know, there might be 40 or 50, yeah.
Lots of kids?
Lots of kids, yeah. It was a great day. The kids used to look forward to it. Part of the school, the hall was part of the Meroo community. That was built in 1933. A little bit of history about that, which I gleaned from George Marshall, and I think also my father spoke about it. To build a hall in the community, and it was right beside the highway, the old highway that was there. It was either going to be on Tom Hitchcock's land or
Dick Barron.
And apparently the hall was eventually built on Tom Hitchcock's land. Yeah, so the Meroo Hall, became a focal point for the community, and it was sort of opposite the school. They used to have end-of-year function there for the school presentation, I suppose, and also a Christmas function, which the whole community would welcome to attend, and of course everyone brought a plate, and there was always a wonderful supper, as you could imagine. A lot of fun for the kids. Santa Claus would arrive. The hall was also used by the community for other different functions throughout the year. Like if there was a local resident was leaving, they'd have a farewell there in the hall. Or if a new family moved into the district, they'd have a welcoming get-together there at the hall. And there was a lot of dances there in the early days. My mother's family, actually the Walsh family orchestra, used to play there.
Who in the Walsh family? Do you know who played and what instrument?
It would have been Mum's brothers and her sister Sheila. Mum was a bit young to be playing at that stage, but her brother Frank, Mick and Bede and Tom and Ted, I'm not sure whether they were all in it, but they were all very musical. They all played, I can't remember, I know there was saxophones involved and pianos. And
so they must have been trained as young kids?
I think a lot of it, they were probably self-taught, I think. I'm not sure whether they had lessons, but they were very well known around in the district. They used to play in a lot of places. Mum, she became a very accomplished singer, and you sang at many, many weddings and events right throughout the district, and involved with the church and the choir. And that's.
So you'd go to Meroo Church, or where?
No, we went to the Catholic Church in Nowra. The Meroo Church would have been functioning in those early days. Obviously, it was a union church, so it was different denominations, but the Catholic Church didn't have services there.
So you said something about Meroo Church and the stained glass in the windows.
Yeah, that stained glass window was commissioned by Rennie Marshall, one of George and Len Marshall's sister, and her brother, then George and Len's brother, Mark, was killed in the Second World War in New Guinea, and she had that stained glass window commissioned in memory of Mark.
Can you recall that window, what it looks like?
Yeah, it was very, because it was on the western side, and so when the sun was shining through it, I mean, all those stained glass windows are amazing what they can do. So it is very
Beautiful.
beautiful tribute to one of the local pioneering families. And that church itself it was used a lot, but then it fell into like it wasn't used, and there was, I can't remember, it'd be 35 years ago or so, there was an advertisement appeared in the local paper that the council was going to sell the land, because that was left by David Berry to the people of Meroo, and also the same church was built out at Greenwell Point. So there was an advertisement appeared that the council were going to sell the land, and Rennie Marshall, or Morrissey, her daughter Marcia, who lived next door to us in Lemons Lane in the old Charlie Lemond house, she was pretty upset about that, and a lot of other people were very upset about that and said, no, this is not going to happen. And so the Meroo community got together, formed a committee called the Friends of Meroo Union Church. The Friends of Meroo Union Church took over the running and maintenance of that block of land. There's a couple of acres there. So
what era are we talking about?
That's about the 1990s or late 80s.
Were you involved in that?
No, but my father and mother were very, very involved in that. I was busy working on the farm, but Dad sort of had a bit more time, and he was very involved with that. And it became a focal point. They have services there, and I think they still have services there, probably once a month by the different denominations. And it was very moving. Our eldest daughter was married there in 2005, which was very touching and very, very special to us. And there's other tributes in the plaques on the wall for all the people from Meroo that went and served in the war or were unfortunately killed in the war as well.
You said George Marshall said a few things to you before he passed, or what was the context of the conversation? And
I was just filling in some holes that I had from, unfortunately, after my father passed away, I had a lot of questions about Meroo that he would have known, and I sort of always sorry that I'd never followed up on some of that things. I mean, at the time you're young and you just don't think about it, and that's why I find this is so fascinating to find people that can recall all this sort of information that's important to be recorded. Yeah, he told me a bit about Charlie Lemond, and I mentioned that about the sale. And
describe it again. So what happened?
Well, Charlie Lemond, after he died, his land was sold, or he had a fair bit of land around Meroo. I'm not sure how much, but he had that block on Lemons Lane on the right as you drive down, 80 odd acres there, and that was a block of land that we ended up buying in 1973, except for the 2 acres that the old house, Charlie Lemond's house, is on there, because that was Leonard Marshall's niece, Marcia, and her husband, Ray Collins, got that old house, and it had been completely run down, and no one had lived in it for about 30 or 40 years. And so it was a bit run down, but they did a marvellous job of restoring it and bringing it back to life, and it was just a credit to them, the way they did that. And then they took off 2 acres, and we purchased the other 79 acres that was there. They'd built that in 1973. After he passed away, I think it was his estate in 1908. So, and then he must have had 100 acres on the swamp that my grandfather bought as well at the time.
What was your grandfather's full name?
His name was Albert too, but he was known as Bert Muller.
And who did he marry?
Bridget Morrissey. I think she was from South Australia. I'm not sure how they met or anything, but yeah. So that was 1908. And there's this interesting story about I'm not sure whether it's been mentioned, about the Chinaman that had a couple of acres there in that corner of that block that we bought, virtually at the northeastern corner of the block, which sort of fronted Lemons Lane and Marshall's Lane, what's now known as Marshall's Lane. There's a Chinaman there that had used to a little market garden, and he lived in a slab hut there. He used to take his grow produce there, and there's still some remains of pipe work and that's still there. We could see it there after we bought the property, and it's still there now. Apparently he used to take his produce into Bomaderry and sell it in there, but he used to go follow along the railway line with the horse and cart. Apparently one night, this is all according to George, he was coming back, I think he visited the pub before he came home, and he coming back and the train hit and killed his horse. So he had no way of getting his produce into town, into Bomaderry. So he moved his farm from there into an area there now which is opposite Hanlon's Windows, apparently. He set up a market garden there, right near Bombadera Creek.
Did you know his name?
No, I don't know his name.
So we're going back to the sale. There was a particular sale under a tree.
Yeah, that was Charlie Lemon had the sale of his cattle, which would have been a big sale because he had some pretty well, used to show his cattle. I think he had a pretty good herd. And he did tell me that an auctioneer from Sydney came down to sell them, and that they washed them in the creek. You know, you're selling cattle, you've got to prepare them and make them look good. So they had the creek ran through the corner of that property, and so Tandingala Creek.
Was there any mention of the herd? What type of breed?
I think they would have been Ayrshire or Shorthorn.
So the Ayrshire breed, do you know much about that breed when it first came?
It was probably one of the most popular breeds around. Then the Friesians were introduced, particularly in the 50s, late 50s, when the Graham Park breeding facility was opened, and it opened up opportunity for farmers to use semen from bulls that were from overseas or for England and Canada mainly at that time, and also Australian bulls too, so Friesian herds.
Do you know who bought the cattle?
Probably mostly local people would have bought the cattle at that particular sale.
And you said it was what type of tree?
Fig tree, and the big fig tree is still there, still standing. It's a strangler fig, which I learned a bit about later. I didn't realise what it was at the time, but it's a strangler fig, and you can actually see how it's completely strangled, probably a tea tree that was growing there. You can see the inside of the tea tree inside it, so it's probably hundreds of years old. It's fascinating. There's a couple of others down there as well doing the same thing. They would have been probably fig seeds from up in the mountain that were dropped by birds flying down from the mountain, dropped into the tree, and then they germinate and slowly over hundreds of years strangle the tree, grow on the tree, send the roots down to the ground. Beautiful trees, aren't they? They are, yeah, it's amazing.
What else did George tell you? Do you remember George and Len there?
Oh yeah, I remember we used to. One of the other stories was that with Lemons Lane, used to run from the highway right down to the railway line. But in the early 60s, the bridge was washed out. There's an old wooden timber bridge there, was washed out. So at that stage, they used to go down Lemons Lane to get to their property. So once that was washed out, it wasn't replaced by council until later on, which I'll get to. They constructed a lane just for them up what is now Marshall's Lane. They owned land on the western side of what is now Marshall's Lane. George and Len both owned a bit of land there. And they built that road up themselves, which is a little tractor and pick and shovel. Probably in the 60s, when that bridge was originally washed out. And because we had land on the swamp, so we had to access that land too. And once that bridge was gone, we didn't have access. So what Dad and I can still remember doing it myself on a little pony, taking cattle down to our swamp run block, which was over the railway line at the end of Lemons Lane. We'd have to go down Lemons Lane and then go into the Leonard's property and chase the cattle through there and put them out down the corner and then cross the railway line into our property. So it was a big day out because Leonard would have his cattle in there, or Marshalls would have their cattle in there, and we'd have 3 or 4 or 5 cows or whatever, and you'd have to keep them separate. And so Dad was on horseback and had a good dog, and so we were able to do that. But it was a bit of hard work. And then you'd have to bring cattle from the swamp back up through the same way, reverse. We also had a property up the end of Strongs Road, a run up there which my grandfather had purchased sometime probably in the 1920s, 30s.
Sorry.
And to get our cattle up there, we would have to take them down Lemons Lane, up what is now Marshall's Lane, across the highway, up Devitt's Lane, and then we'd chase them up through Wessie Waters' place up the side of the hill. There was a bit of a track up the side of the hill. So that was a big day out because these heifers that we used to put young stock up there, they would never been there before, so they didn't know where they were going. So it was usually it was best way to do it was on foot. So that's where us kids came in handy with the dog, Dad on horseback. We'd herd them up the side of the mountain and get them up to the top, put them in a yard, and then there'd be some up there that'd have to come back. So we'd have to bring some back because they might have to go with the bull. They were old enough to be mated and come into the herd, so we'd have to reverse the procedure and bring them back down through Wessie Waters, down Devitt's Lane, back across the highway, all the way back home. So it was a big day out. And that happened up until about the 1970s, early 1970s. We'd purchased this other land at Leonard Marshall's block. We'd also purchased a bit of George Marshall's block, 25 acres over the creek beside the lane that's now Marshall's Lane. And Dad used to share that with his brother Norman, who lived in Muller's Lane. He had a dairy farm there too, and he used to put some of his stock up there. But he used to truck them up there and jump off the truck up near which we probably should have done that too. Would have been a lot easier. But
so you didn't need to cross the highway and go up. You sold the land up at Strong.
Yeah, eventually Dad and his brother Norman sold that land, and so we didn't need that. So because we had more land, and we bought other landers too, which was George Martin's, which was Tom Hitchcock's farm. We bought 65 acres of that in 1981 as well. So we had eventually ended up with all our land. Right.
Many acres did you end up with, and how many cows are you milking?
We ended up with 360 acres about. We sold the swamp block in 2000, and we bought part of Les Vaughan's farm, which used to belong to one stage by my great uncle Jacob Muller. We didn't need the mountain block anymore, which was a good thing. It was always hard work going up there. We just about get the heifers to the top, and then one would bolt straight down to the bottom, so you'd have to let them all go back down, start all over again. That was pretty well.
And what are you carrying with you? Like, what are you doing? You using your hands?
Yeah, just on foot. Dad had stock whip, had the dog, get them on the track, and hopefully they stay there. It was a lot of work, a lot of hard work, but it was just what he did.
Yes. So your father's full name, and who did he marry?
He was Albert Timothy Muller, and he married Veronica Walsh, or Vonnie, as she's known right through the community.
And
in 1948, I married.
Yes, and what year was he born?
Dad and Mum were both born in 1924.
And Vonnie's still alive?
Vonnie's still alive. She's just turned 100.
And what about your siblings and their names and years?
Two older brothers, Michael, who's 75, Greg's 73. Then me, then my sister Kathy, she's 69. Brian, he's 66, and Margaret, and then David. So David's the youngest, he's 61.
There's a few of you helping out with the cows.
When it was required around the farm, we all chipped in. We all had jobs to do. We all helped with the milking. Because we were all off at school, he had to employ labour, which was always a problem to try getting good labour. I know Mum did an enormous amount of work, and we really respect what Mum did, because she was, apart from raising us 7 kids, she was keeping the house, helping Dad, doing different chores and everything, and she was very involved in the community as well, so she was amazing. So
what was she doing in the community?
Originally with the school and the church. She was on the P&Cs and P&Fs at St Michael's, and the church. She was very involved with the Catholic Church in Nowra and the choir and things like that.
So your father was a volunteer for the rural fire?
Yeah, they were all volunteers, and they had a bit of equipment at Meroo, and one thing they were involved in fighting the fires.
Fires occurred in 1968.
And we were up on the hill near towards our run, and up the back near Boxwells, up that way, a bit further around towards the north. I remember going up there with the knapsacks and the rakes and just trying to beat it all out, stop it burning. Burnt right down to the highway nearly at Jasper's Brush that year. It was a very dry year.
How intense was that, fighting it?
I was only 14 years old then, 15 years old, and it was pretty intense. And the sky was just, whether you can remember, it was like 4 or 5 years ago when we had those big fires. It was just like that. The sky was black, there was ash falling everywhere. It was pretty horrible, very, very scary, ominous looking sky.
How much milk were you producing a day?
So when I started working with Dad in 1973. When I left school in 1971, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, and the opportunity came up to start doing accountancy. It was a sort of career that Dad and Mum envisaged would be good for us kids. He didn't think, dairy farming wasn't, you can do something better than dairy farming. Dairy farming was considered a good occupation, but hard work, obviously, but he wanted something better for all of us. And I thought, well, I'll give it a go. And so I started with a local accountancy firm in town. It was Rossop, Leslie and Payne at the time, and became John Tobin and Co. And John Tobin, I was very grateful to him, give me that opportunity as a 17-year-old and straight out of school to start doing accountancy, and which was something very new to me because I did not know the difference between a debit and a credit. but I quickly learned. And so all the books were done by hand then. They were all written up. Cash books were written up, journals and ledgers and everything. So I quickly learned how it all went together. So after about 2 years there, I suppose I was a bit restless. I always thought I would end up doing something outdoors. I was looking at national parks or forestry or agriculture or something. When I ended up in an office, I was a bit surprised in a way, but it would have been a good career, but it wasn't for me. So I had to come and tell Dad and Mum that I wanted to leave that and wanted to come work on the farm. Massive turnover of labour, getting good, reliable labour.
Why is that?
Oh, it's just getting people prepared to work hard, and still the same today. And you've got to have someone that's trustworthy, and you're working with your cattle and all the machinery and everything. So I told Dad I wanted to come and work on the farm, and he said, no, you've got to finish your accountancy course first. I said, right, I'll do that. And I was doing it by correspondence, but that didn't last very long, and he just said, well, I'm glad you're here, but I hope you don't regret what you did, and I never did. I learned a lot in those 2 years doing accountancy, so I was able to do the books right up till now.
Yes.
Understood it all.
Must have been. It's difficult correspondence, I would imagine, when you're isolated as well.
Yeah, it was, but there was no computers around then, so that's the only way I could do the course was by correspondence.
By post?
By post, yeah. Do your assignments, post them away, get the results back, and then do the next assignment, post it away. So
when we talked last, your family had some connection to the post office.
Everyone in Meroo had a connection to the post office because it was central. The school, the post office and the church were central to it. And a lot of the other little communities around the district were all much the same. We used to, the post office and the telephone exchange, I can still remember going knock on the window to get our mail, and, Ada Marshall would be there, and then she'd say, excuse me, and she'd have to, the phone would ring and she'd put the plugs in to connect the phones. And
the switchboard. The
switchboard on the big switch. I can still picture it in my mind. And also they had a small dairy there, and Dad ended up leasing that dairy there because it had a 20-gallon quota on it. And at that time, if you wanted to grow your business, you could buy quota or lease land that had quota on it and bring it to your property. So that's what we leased that for about 23 years, I think, off Ada and Polly, and then when they passed away, it was their estate, and eventually they sold it. And so we used to put cattle up there. Same thing, we used to run them across the highway until it got too busy, and then we bought a trailer and we could take them up on a tractor.
How did you manage the traffic on the highway?
Well, it was nowhere near like it is now. If we were shifting the cattle up to our mountain block, we would there were always plenty of us, so we'd just stop the traffic. Someone would stand out in the middle of the road, traffic would stop, push the cows across, and away we go.
Did you separate the calves?
We made sure they were always at home on the dairy. We had a separate place where they'd calve, and you'd have to. We did separate them. It was always hard, but that's what we did to rear, particularly the heifer calves. We were rearing them up for the herd for replacements.
So you leased how much land from the Marshall girls?
There was only 25 acres there, but we'd end up buying. I'll just run through the purchases. 1967, Dad bought 25 acres on the eastern end of the property, which joined the original 86 acres, off George Marshall in 1967. Then in 1973, bought the other 89 acres off Leonard Marshall. That's where Jeanette and I built our home on that block. 1981, Fred and Mari Martin and their son John they were only a small operation. They were milking 35 cows, 40 cows. They decided they'd had enough, so they got out. Fred was getting on a bit in age, and John didn't want to keep on milking, so we bought 65 acres there. 2000, we bought the part of Les Vaughan's, which was originally owned by my great uncle Jacob Muller. There was 65 acres there. In 2006, there was another block which ended up being right in the middle of all the land that we'd owned and purchased that we'd been leasing for about 15 or 20 years. It was the estate of Artie Hearn, and we bought 40 acres there, and we had an arrangement with another fellow, Glenn Mitchell, who lived at Jasper's Brush, and we ended up with 40 acres and he got 10-acre blocks there. So that ended up, after selling the swamp block when we purchased Les Vaughan's block, we ended up with about 360 acres, all joined together, which made it really easy to manage, and was a lot to manage, but it was.
So you had 360 acres in total.
Yeah.
Is that the biggest land you had?
Yeah, that was the most we ever owned.
And how many cows and what are you growing?
When we finished up When I finished up it was about 2012, we were milking about 180 cows. But when I started out in 1973, we would have been milking about 70. So we've grown just gradually over that period of time. But we would have had over 300 head altogether with replacement heifers and dry cows.
Who's collecting your milk?
Originally it was sent into the Nowra Dairy Company, and then Nowra Dairy Company had an amalgamation about 1989-90 with Hunter Valley Dairy Farmers and Shoalhaven Dairy Company, formed Australian Cooperative Foods, and they were still going into Nowra, but Nowra had built a new factory there, down on, which is now part of the Meadow group there on Bowlong Road. So they built that factory in 1986. And
a milk factory?
Yeah, a new milk factory there. And then that became Dairy Farmers Milk Company Cooperative.
And how did Meroo get on with Jasper's Brush and Berry Milk Cooperatives?
That was sort of go way back. Berry Cooperative was still operating then. They opted not to become part of the amalgamation, and they proved to be very successful in their own right, but even though it was a small cooperative, it seemed to go pretty well. But back in the day, there was Meroo Cooperative, which I think was on the corner of Meroo Road and the highway there, somewhere there, or near Fletcher's Lane. Jasper's Brush Factory, and I think my grandfather used to supply Jasper's Brush Factory. I can recall too in some writings that my Uncle Norma did, that he used to take the milk to the factory, when he was only 14, he'd drive the truck to the Jasper's Brush Factory. Ute Dodge truck, I think he had.
How much would he have on the back of that?
I don't know, it might have been only about 8 cans or something like that, 10 cans, which was about 80 gallons. But then they were doing butter then, Berry Factory, but then they started to send their milk to Sydney. They had to spend a lot of money to upgrade the Jasper's Brush Factory. They couldn't do it, so they decided to shut down. And I think half the supplies around the Jasper's Brush Meroo area went to Berry and the other half went to Nowra. My great-grandfather ended up taking his milk to Nowra, and he actually started carting, and then he started carting for milk for other farmers in the Meroo area as well. And he had a Dodge truck.
Tell me about that house. You were talking about a house that was moved.
Yeah, well, that's the house down Lamonds Lane that Charlie Lamond built, or he moved part of it to there, obviously just after he purchased the land there. And
where did he move it from?
Narra Hill. Apparently he had a tannery out there, and it was part of the house he probably lived in there, and he moved that to Meroo and then probably added on to it. I'm not sure who the builder was. I don't believe it was my great uncle George. I think it was someone else, but it's a lovely old house in the same style as Pomona. And it's a beautiful old home now. It's been lovingly restored by, first of all, Ray and Marcia Collins, and then the current owners. They're there now. The couple that moved down from Sydney, and they've done an amazing job in restoring it.
How would they have moved that house?
I don't know. Might have pulled it to bits and restructured it, and probably would have been horse and cart for sure.
Do you remember butter trails yourself, logging trails?
After those fires went through in 1969, we went up after the fires, and we had cattle up there under the mountain, under the escarpment, and we couldn't find them. Eventually we found them. They were right up on top of the escarpment. How they got there was an old pony trail that went up the side of the mountain around the edge of the property that we owned there, and they must have found that and gone up. So we had to go up and chase them back down. So it was pretty steep. Mum's brothers, Tom and Ted Walsh, Mum moved from Kangaroo Valley to Far Meadow when she was 12 years old, and they still had a property in Kangaroo Valley, but they were out at Far Meadow. And Tom and Ted, when they were only about 12 years old, they would move cattle on horseback from Far Meadow over Berry, up over the mountain to Kangaroo Valley. They must have taken 2 or 3 days. So their mother would have packed all their lunch. They went over there, and they'd bring cattle back as well. And Uncle Norman, he kept he just wrote a bit about his life story, which was really fascinating. And you might find out more about that if you talk to Peter Muller, who lived in Muller's Lane. He talks of when he was 14 living at Pomona, he would take cattle from Pomona down to his Uncle Jim Ryan's place down at Piree, drive them all the way on horseback in through town down to Piree. Mother would have to give a note for him to take to school to say he wouldn't be at school tomorrow because he'd be shifting cattle. Remember that there was nowhere near the amount of people, traffic, houses around then. And it would have been just basically a dirt road into town, probably across the bridge. And they used to take cattle into the sale yards in town too. Dad spoke about that. He used to drive cattle into the sale yards on horseback.
Where's the sale yards?
The sale yards used to be opposite the ex-servicemen's club in Nowra, where the car park is. That was moved from there in the early 70s, I think, out to where it is now in Mossvale Road. One story I hear is of people would be driving their cattle up Bridge Road, because that was the old highway then. People would make sure they left their gates closed because the cattle could get into their yard. And I heard one story of I'm not sure whether it was my father or someone else was chasing cattle up there, and someone had left their gate open. The front door was open. The cow went straight up through the front gate, through the front door, and out the back door. So there's all sorts of stories like that you can pick up from around the place. It's just a different life and different times.
Great visual.
Yeah.
So let's talk about crops and mechanisation. What sort of tractors did you have on the property? Were you growing corn, or how did you have silos? Yeah,
the silo on Pomona was built, and the stalls were built, I think, in about the 1940s. Yeah, they used to grow corn and sacchaline and millet, and there was a pit down near the creek on Pomona where they used to put it into that. They just cut it and put it in, and then they'd cover it to preserve it. And then when they go to feed it out in the winter, they would have to dig it out, and then they'd put it through a chaff cutter to chop it up for the cattle to eat and feed it out in bags, actually. So it was a lot of hard work then. But then after they built the silo, they grew corn, cut that by hand and put it up through the chaff cutter up into the silo. And Dad was only milking about 40, 50 cows then. That was enough to keep them going for 2 or 3 months. Pretty exciting time for us. A lot of hard work for the adults. Well, when I got a bit older, obviously I was doing the work too, cutting corn by hand and loading it onto the trailers and putting it through the chaff cutter and up into the silo. Then you'd have to get up in the silo and spread it with a fork and tramp it all down to get all the air out. And then we'd cover it up with a bit of sawdust, and time come to feed it out, you'd have to fork it all back out into a trolley that we had. I'll never forget the smell of the corn silage. It's beautiful. To me, it's a beautiful smell. When it's made properly, it's just a really beautiful smell, and the cows loved it. So you'd have to seal it. You'd always lose a bit off the top, which you'd have to toss out.
When you talk about the pit, you're talking about a large hole in the ground, are you?
Yeah, that was, yeah. That's what we had.
How early would that pit have been operating?
Oh, I don't know when they would have built that, possibly in the 1930s, 40s.
Would that have been a risk with flooding?
No, it was just above the flood level where they had it. A lot of people used to store it above ground. You still see it now around the district. They store it above ground, then they cover it with plastic and then seal it off with tyres or whatever. You just got to keep the air out of it. And that's basically what the silos did. We'd feed it out, fork it into a trolley, then fork it onto the individual stalls, and the cows would come in. You have a headlock, so you'd lock them in place so that they couldn't get out. And so
how big were your feed stalls? How many?
We had 32, 16 each side. Fair size, so some of them used to be bigger than that, some smaller, depending on the size of the herd. But then eventually we got too many cows. There was too many to feed in the stall, so we stopped using the silos because we had that many cows. You couldn't get enough food into it. And by that time we were starting to make round bale silage.
How'd you make that?
You cut the grass, good grass, ryegrass, clover pastures in the spring mainly. You'd only have to wilt it for a day or two, get most of the moisture out of it. You bale it up with a bit of moisture in it and then wrap it in the plastic that you see all around the place now. And much quicker and easier way. It was a one-man operation basically to do that. We ended up buying our own baler and wrapper, and we could do it whenever we wanted to. So that was in about the 90s we started doing that. Prior to that was all little bales of hay and hay sheds.
What about stooking the hay? Do you remember that at all?
No, I don't, thank goodness. That would have been hard work.
Tell the listeners what that stooking is.
That's when the grass is cut, because there's no machines to pick it up and bale it, so to speak. But I think there was a rake that would used to sort of drag a row into a heap, and then they'd have to be, I think they just used to tie it up and wrap it up.
Looked a bit like a teepee, didn't it?
Yeah, something like that. They'd wrap it up like that. And then I think they used to, in hay sheds or whatever.
Yeah, they would have put it up in the hay shed.
Lift it up into the hay shed. Yeah, it would have had to been pretty dry.
Because they've got to put it, do you remember a slide operating at all in the field?
Oh yeah, we had a slide that we used to use cutting the corn. We load the corn on it because the slide was low, so you didn't have to lift it up. And we had trolleys as well, but I can still remember the slide being actually pulled by the draft also. Tell
me about your first tractors that you remember, and what may have been, who supplied them, do you know, and what, do you have any with metal wheels at all, like scarifying?
No,
or?
I can't remember any of the metal wheels, but the first one I think was a little International B275, I think, that Dad would have bought from, would have been They were called Truck and Farm there. They were down in East Street in Nowra. Fred Porter was the owner of that. Dad used to buy it. He bought a slasher off him and little ploughs and everything. Everything was small then because it had to be with the... They're only about a 40 horsepower tractor, 45 horsepower tractor, so you couldn't have too big a machinery. The machinery would suit the tractor. So eventually we got up to over 100 horsepower tractors when we finished. Then your machinery got bigger and bigger as you went because you were working more and more land.
What about your cows? What's the evolution for you?
Well, when I was young, I only remember the air shears, basically nearly all air shears. And then in the 60s, early 60s, Dad started to use the AI across the air shears with Friesian bulls. Generally, you'd get a black and white calf. In 1973, there probably would have been about 50-50 air shear and Friesian. And eventually crossing the air shear cows with Friesians, after 5 generations, you could have what could be considered a purebred Friesian. So eventually we bred out all the air shear. The air shears provided, some of the air shear cows we have were good air shears, and they provided a very good base for some of the Friesian cows we ended up breeding. We had some very good families come from the air shear cows that we had.
Did you have a stud name?
Yeah, we did, and of course that was Pomona. So by the time by about 2000 or so, the whole herd was pretty well all fully registered, and we had a very good herd. We didn't show cattle, did dabble in it once or twice, but it was a lot of work, and I didn't have the time. And Dad and grandfather, they used to show some of their air shears, and he got reserve champions show bull at Nowra 2 years in a row. So Basil, yeah, he's I've still got his photo. I've got it hanging up in the wall at home. Yeah, Dad would have bred a lot of cattle from him, and I can't recall, it was before my time. That was in 1951, 52. So one thing with the Friesian herd eventually right at the end when we finished up, they have what they call a Master Breeder Award, which it's awarded to breeders in the Friesian herd it's based on results over a 20-year period and the number of cattle you breed and type and all that sort of thing. And you have to get more points for your herd than the number of animals you bred over that 20-year period. Yeah, but we ended up with a Master Breeder Award, which was really a feather in our cap and something that I felt very proud of achieving. We both felt very proud of achieving after all that time. And unfortunately, Dad wasn't around to see that. So
I might just ask you at this point, your wife, and you met her somehow connected to...
Rural Youth was very big in the early 70s. And when I started working on the farm, I started to make contact with other farmers, obviously, and the Rural Youth Organisation, so I started going to Rural Youth. It was focused on social and educational type of organisation for young people, basically from 18 to 30. There was actually Department of Agriculture offices spread throughout the state in different, I think it was about 7 different regions, field days and educational activities for the various rural youth clubs in the regions. And so I became involved in that. I actually became president for a couple of years, and I was fortunate enough to win an exchange trip to the Waikato region in New Zealand. They have a reciprocal arrangement with the South Coast region, New South Wales. When I came back, there was a new girl in the club, and that was Jeanette King, and she was one of the kings from Number and the other side of the river. Her father was Rex, and parents were Rex and Daisy. And they were part of the Number Park farm down there. Her Uncle Brian and Father Rex were running the Number Park stud. And then when we were married in 1978 and brought our family up there, living in the middle of the farm, and it was a wonderful experience and very, very fortunate. And it was a wonderful environment to bring up a family.
Tell me your children's names and their years of birth.
Janelle was born in 1979. She's living in Goulburn. Christine, born in 1981. Christine's living up in the lower Blue Mountains. Brendan's Shoalhaven Heads, born in 1983. And Belinda was born in 1989. She's currently in America with her husband working as managing a ranch over there. So.
What was so special about Pomona's still around? The house is it heritage listed? Or?
The house was heritage listed, yeah. And when we were there, we managed to get some funding to repair different things like bay windows and veranda and stuff. It wasn't much, but it was enough to encourage us to go ahead and do it. And I noticed that the people that purchased the property had just had the roof replaced about 2 or 3 years ago.
Do you miss Pomona? Do you miss the cows?
Yeah, we do. We miss the animals in particular. You know, it's just very satisfying breeding the cattle and from young calves and breeding them up into the herd. And of course the hardest part was when you had to part with them for various reasons, old age, sickness, injury, mastitis, things like that. But we do really miss working with the animals.
The relationship.
Yeah. They became like part of the family. I mean, and it was always hard when you had to put one down, or extremely hard.
It's awful.
So it was horrible. It was the worst part of the job. Honestly, it really was. And we had each other, and that's what kept us going through all the hard times, and also the support that we got from Mum and Dad. They encouraged us, and we're very grateful for that.
It sounds like you had good parents.
No, they were wonderful. Wonderful to all of us. All us kids, we were all very, very lucky to have them as parents. That's why I found this so fascinating to read this. It's bringing up things, and I'll hear other podcasts from other, and I already have from David and Richard, and it just prompts your memory. So, and I'm sure this will prompt memories of other people, and I think it's fantastic what you're doing to record this, and it's there forever, and hopefully people will be able to get an understanding of what life was like. For only for us, but for our parents and our grandparents growing up. And I always said I never worked as hard physically as what my grandfather and father would have worked. But it was much more intense because our operations were becoming so much bigger, but with more machinery to do the jobs. But you were working just as hard or harder, but not as hard physically. It
would have been costing more with machinery, is that right?
Oh, machinery, yeah, it was expensive, but you had to be making sure you were utilising it. You'd buy machinery to make sure that it was cost effective and adding to your profitability, if that's possible.
Was there any particular piece of machinery you liked more than others? Did you like being on the tractor, for example?
I did like doing tractor work, and I like you hear of some farmers they just like the tractor work and they don't want to work with the cows, and others like the cows and don't want to do the machinery. I was happy doing either, and I enjoyed doing both. I like to keep in touch with the cows. You saw them every day, so you could pick up things with them if they were sick or whatever, and we got a lot of satisfaction out of looking at the cows. They come in and they look big, udder full of milk when they're in the peak of their condition and milking. It was very, very satisfying. And to see all that work that you put in. I used to say that milking was a chore and I always said milking was a chore you did before you started work and a chore you had to do before you knocked off. And that's the way I looked at milking, even though it was a very important part of it and it's something I enjoyed doing. All the work in between, pasture maintenance, feeding, topping paddocks, everything that you did in between, fixing fences and machinery, all that had to be done in between the milkings. And a lot of people would think that, you just milked the cows and that was it, but I was just full on. I was working probably 80 hours a week or more. I remember one year I had to fill in a census form, and said, how many hours did you work in the last week? And I said, I'll just put down 75. I said, no, I'll work it out. I worked it out for the last week. It was only 2 boxes. I got 96 hours. Because I used to do the bookwork. There was herd records to keep at night, bookwork, which I never had time to do during the day, so I'd do 3 or 4 nights a week. I'll be doing a couple of hours work at night on the books. It was very intense, but absolutely no regrets.
And that's a really important thing to say, isn't it?
Yeah.
I just want to hear about the challenges of living on a floodplain You were living on a floodplain? No,
where we were, we weren't floodplain prone. We get very wet. We were on the western side of the railway line, and there was never any floods. Never flooded on the western side of the railway. But because of that creek that we had running through, it would we'd get flash floods through that. And that was always a pain, because it would come up and there'd be a hell of a lot of water and it'd wipe out fences. It'd leave a lot of rubbish over all the paddocks, a few days fixing up fences and picking up rubbish and getting rid of that. It was, we were never bothered by floods, except when we had the 100 acres on the swamp. 3/4 of that or a bit more used to go underwater, but but there was always a high ground where the cattle could get, so it was never an issue.
With Jasper's Brush Railway going, did that impact you at all?
No, we didn't have... No. I can't recall a Jasper's Brush railway station going. There was actually land set aside for a railway station at Meroo, at the end of Lamonds Lane. I imagine they didn't go ahead with it because I was only a couple of miles into Bomaderry, and Jasper's Brush was just up the road as well. But there was a parcel of land there that was cut out, and that block there that George Marshall owned was eventually subdivided, and someone who bought that land, they were joined up where this railway station was supposed to be. I think they ended up buying it for probably just a few dollars or just the cost so they could even up their block. It was a bit tricky putting the cows across the railway line there sometimes. Yeah.
Tell me.
Oh, there was a couple of close calls. We did end up losing a couple of cows from time to time because they get through the fence and get up on the railway line. But I remember one year we were there and we'd close the gates, we'd have the cows ready to come across the railway line, chase them across. And we had them there this year, and I thought I could hear a train coming. And I was watching towards Berry, looking north towards Berry, and it sounded like a train. I listened for, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 minutes it might have been. I just listened, no, it stopped coming. So I think Jeanette was there, and I said, righto, I'll open the gate, you chase them across, she'll be behind them, we'd have to chase them across the railway. I put a bit of rope across the railway line, across the post, so the cows would just go straight across and not shoot up the sides. Tied that up, put it up, watching north, and I said, right, I'll open the gate. She started chasing. I looked over my shoulder back towards Bomaderry, and the train was coming around the corner. I hadn't heard it because the noise from the highway was coming from the north. And I jumped in front of the cow, just stopped them in time, and closed the gate. And it was pretty close. Put the wind up us. Train went straight through the baling twine, ripped it, knocked it all out. So, yeah, but it was always a bit hairy. But yeah, you knew what time the trains were coming mostly.
Speaking of the wind, just to fit, do you get a bit of wind blowing through there?
Oh, they say there's a sign up say Meroo Aboriginal for lightning. I think they got it wrong. It should be Aboriginal for wind. The winds were horrendous through Meroo. Notoriously bad area for wind. I don't know whether it's something to do with the mountain or what, but it just seemed to whip around that mountain, and we had used to get horrendous westerly winds. It seemed to blow for weeks on end sometimes through the July-August period. And they were just... Nothing annoyed me more than the westerly wind on the farm. It would just be... It was hard to work in. I hated working in it. And it would just... You'd have good pastures and be nice moisture in the ground, and you get the westerly wind for a week and it'd just burn the pastures off and dry the ground out, and all that moisture would be gone. So that was one of the worst aspects of living in Meroo. Other than that, it was a lovely place to live, and we really enjoyed it was very hard to leave when the time came.
And what year was that?
Jeanette and I finished up milking in about 2011. I got to the point where I was just worn out, mentally and physically. I wanted to keep going, but I couldn't. And I loved the job. I still enjoyed what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't keep going, and so we leased it for a while. At the time, our youngest daughter, was working with us, and she was enjoying it, but she wanted to do other things, and then she met a young fella from down near Holbrook, and at that time I just said, look, if she wanted to do it, I would have kept going, but it would have been hard for me. And it was hard for Jeanette as well. She enjoyed it, but...
that's all she'd known.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, she used to help her father when she was 8, 9 years old, driving tractors and doing milking and all that sort of thing, so she really loved her life. But yeah, it was a hard decision to finish up because I knew it would be the end of the line for the mowers at Pomona, and I knew it was a right thing to do in the end. It wasn't necessarily the right thing to do, but I knew I had to do it. And so we hung on, we leased it for 5 years, but then there was no way I was going back to it, and I couldn't. So in 2016, we were still living we had a 1 hectare block where Jeanette and I built next to the Charlie Lemon's old house. So we lived there for a while, but it wasn't our farm anymore. We liked where we lived. We loved the aspect, and we had great neighbours there, and we just got to the point where no, I can't live here anymore. We've got to move, and so we put it on the market and moved to Goulburn, where our eldest daughter was, get away from the coast. We found the coast was getting a bit suffocating for us from what we remembered it to be.
And how's life today?
Lovely, great. We miss Pomona.
You find you're getting your energy back?
Well, yeah, I did.
You're healing?
I have. No one can ever take away the memories we have. We have a lot of memorabilia of Pomona, which is sometimes hard to look at, but I've got that, and we're really embracing their life now. And I know if I'd have kept going, I wouldn't be like I am now. So,
well, it sounds like you've had a satisfying life.
A very, very satisfying and very rewarding, and been very, very fortunate and very grateful for the opportunities we have, courtesy of my mother and father and my family, and my wife. Jeanette,
She looks strong.
She's very strong. Very strong.
It's good, isn't it?
It is. She carries me.
That's good. Today is the 11th of March 2025, which happens to be the 47th wedding anniversary of Jeanette and Patrick Muller. I'm sending love their way with a deep respect for their journey together. A component of this episode is supported by Turfco, our region's largest agricultural employer, operating in this area for 40 years. Thank you, Gavin. Future episodes of the Dairy Lane project will be uploaded now every 3 weeks due to the enormity of the project and myself as the sole professional person donating my entire time to these works. This project is unfunded to date. However, there are 2 seasons mapped out to be produced. In a week or so, you will be able to purchase printed maps, a t-shirt and posters on this project from my website, theresesweeney.com.au. If you'd like to discuss being a sponsor toward this important history project and digital legacy for your community, contact me directly at tsweeneyinc@gmail.com. Until next time, when we go to Devitt's Lane, take care and thanks for listening.